Hello third grade, so today we are going to do our watercolor skill builder. And at the top of the page it says please do not paint directly on this page because I'm going to give you little square papers to fit into these squares. And our learning objective is that we can use and create the following watercolor techniques. We're going to paint thick and thin lines with watercolor. We're going to create a watercolor wash that goes light to dark in value. We're going to do wet on wet watercolor with only warm colors. And then we're going to do wet on wet watercolor with only cool colors. So you are going to start off with 4 white square pieces of paper and a placemat. You're going to place your 4 papers on the placemat and you're going to write your name on all 4 papers. Obviously you're going to flip them over. And let's do our first watercolor skill builder, and that's to paint lines, thick and thin lines. All right, so you're gonna get a paintbrush, a watercolor paintbrush. You wanna get it wet, and you're gonna pick a color on your tray that you wanna use. I'm gonna use a darker color so that you can see easily on the screen. I'm gonna get my paintbrush wet, and I'm gonna get this blue-green color. I'm going to get a puddle of water on that blue-green color. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, get it wet, pull my bristles across the edge of the blue-green oval, and then the water that's in my paintbrush squeezes out onto that color. I'm going to do it again and one more time. So now I have a nice puddle of water on top of my blue-green, and I'm going to take the bristles of my paintbrush and I'm going to gently swirl the water around while I'm touching the paint underneath the water. Now remember, this paint is called watercolor. So we are coloring our water and we're going to paint our water on our paper. So this first paper is thick and thin lines. So you're going to practice keeping your paintbrush up on its tiptoes and then pressing down firmer on your paintbrush. So a thick line, we press down. And if you want to paint your lines going side to side instead of vertical, horizontal instead of vertical, you can. Or to paint thin lines, you are going to paint keeping your paintbrush up on its tiptoes. Maybe you want to try different kinds of lines. But you are going to paint thick and thin. So do at least 4 lines on your paper, 2 thick and 2 thin. Rinse your paintbrush off. And so in the next box, we are going to create a watercolor wash going from light to dark value. So you're gonna pick a color. I'm gonna pick another color, get it wet with a puddle of water on top by dipping my paintbrush in the water. Now I'm going to take the bristles of my paintbrush and wiggle the water around, gently touching the paint underneath. So we're never taking our paintbrush and trying to scoop the paint out from the oval. We're always painting the water that's on top of the paint. So we are creating a watercolor from light to dark. So what I want to do first is I want to get part of my paper wet with just plain water. And then I'm going to lightly touch the paint and then lightly touch the water. Then I'm going to get some more paint on my paintbrush and start on the other side. You can choose to do this any way you want, but you want to have the color go from light to dark. So right now I have light and medium and the paint is starting to move into the lighter area. So I'm going to get a little bit more paint on my paintbrush and add some more darker color here. So that I can show that the paint is going from light to medium to dark. So the learning objective we're supposed to demonstrate is light to dark. So as long as you have a light area and a dark area on your paper, that's good. And just do one color to show that light and dark. Now we're going to do wet on wet, warm colors, wet on wet, cool colors. First thing you need to remember is what the warm colors are, reds, yellows, and oranges. So I'm going to get my red, yellow, and orange paint. I'm going to get some water on top of them. And then wet on wet means that your paper is wet and then you take wet paint and you put wet paint on the wet paper. So I'm going to take plain water and I'm going to paint my paper. Whoops, I got some of the color off of the placemat onto my paper here. So be careful of that. Now I'm going to take my wet paint and just touch the paper and let that color move into the wet paper. I'm making sure that I'm not touching the first color and then mixing it on my tray, that I'm always using a clean paintbrush when I go back to the tray to add more paint on my paper, my paint on my paintbrush. So this is wet on wet. The paper is wet and then I'm taking wet paint and I'm putting wet paint on top of the wet paper. And it's kind of fun to see the colors run around on the paper and blend and mix. All right, and then we're going to do that all over again, but this time with cool colors. So I'm going to get some cool colors on my paint tray with some puddles of water on top of them. Now I'm going to use clean water to get my paper wet. Trying not to get the paint on my placemat onto my paper here. And now I'm just going to take the paint that I have, rinse my paintbrush off when I change to a new color, rinse my paintbrush off when I change to a new color, so that I'm not mixing the colors on the tray here. I can mix them on my paper and let them mix, but I'm not mixing them on the tray. So I shouldn't see anyone take their paintbrush and just wiggle it across all of the colors. We only touch one color at a time with our paintbrush. So there are our watercolor skills, 3rd grade. Thick and thin line, watercolor wash from light to dark, wet on wet warm, wet on wet cool. So you are going to take 2 hands and carry your placemat with your papers, your painted papers on the placemat, and you're going to place this on the drying rack, and then I will tell you how I want you to clean up the paint mess. Good job, 3rd grade.